couple of years ago, in 2023, you may have caught the flurry of excited newspaper articles about yet another discovery from Pompeii, that archaeological gift that keeps on giving. The excavators had uncovered another of the frescoes for which the ancient city is so famous and prized. It's a still life of someone's dinner. Well, you might say, there are so many of those, what's so exciting about that? But the thing that had quickly caught people's attention and raised excited chatter far beyond the world of academia was this round bread-like thing with toppings. The media celebrated the discovery of a 2,000-year-old pizza. And Neapolitan pride was stoked to learn that their much-loved gastronomic speciality had such a venerable tradition, going all the way back to the Roman Empire. The naysayers quickly leapt in, of course, to remind everyone that tomatoes would not even arrive in Italy for well over a millennia when the New World was discovered, and mozzarella hadn't even been invented yet. So this was not, and categorically could not, be a pizza. Not to let facts get in the way of a good story, however, everyone just modified their view a little bit. Okay, so it wasn't a pizza exactly in the same way that Italians will tell you anything with pineapple on it isn't a pizza. But it was clearly something on the way to becoming a pizza-esque focaccia. It was, everyone decided, a proto-pizza. On closer inspection, it became apparent that the toppings were in fact pomegranate, something resembling dates, and spices with other condiments that some people have speculated was some kind of pesto. But the bakers and pizza makers of the Bay of Naples remain satisfied that their beloved tradition has deep roots. And this pride and sense of long continuity may be observed all around the world. People are very attached to their local breads. Where would the French be without their baguettes, the Indians without their naan and roti, the Middle East without its pitta, or indeed the New Yorkers without their bagels? Everywhere bread is iconic of regional and cultural identity. It's often, in a symbolic sense, the foundation of life and family and community. Breaking bread together can be a bonding experience. And of course, Christianity took the symbolism of bread to the next level by turning it into a sacrament, whereby bread is perceived to become the very body of Christ. Bread, therefore, has this evocative power as part of daily life, even religious life, to root us in our communities and engage us in age-old traditions. It encourages us to recall even our distant human past, being part of the basic necessities of life, and also one of the first products of cultivated life. So we see this with the Italians now connecting their doughy tradition of pizza to the breads of their ancient Roman past, and the ancient Romans themselves, likewise, looked back into the even more distant past, and there they perceived a deity, a patron divinity of the baker's oven, a goddess of bread. Although at first this may seem funny, and certainly this is the sort of thing that people like to point out mockingly in the sort of shows that like to cast Roman society as wacky, crazy and depraved, but when you think about it, bread's the product of cultivated fields, milled grains, fermented yeast, tamed fire. In contrast to the wilderness we stepped out of, it's some kind of miracle. Bread is a product of a collective effort, and at the heart of community and family, it has sustained us as a species far, far back into the yeasty mists of time. If you look at our very first preserved written stories, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, we find that the wild, untamed man, Enkidu, becomes civilized and socialized into human culture by learning the arts of fermentation and by taking part in the civilizing acts of making beer and bread. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread is therefore, in a very real sense, the smell of civilization. And so the goddess we visit today is no trivial deity of a half-baked society. Rather, she sits at the very crucible of civilized life. Her ovens are the fragrant furnace that sustains community and daily human existence. And so our second deity of sustenance is not frivolous, but fundamental. Let us follow, then, that warm, drifting smell of roasting grains and baking bread, and let us enter the realm of Fornax. Bread and circuses. This quip from the Roman satirist Juvenal has become a maxim so often repeated that it's become axiomatic of how people think about and describe Roman society, a people preoccupied with and distracted by bread and circuses, panem et circenses. Games are another story for another time, but what did bread actually mean in that ancient context? Where did it come from and what did it signify? What was its role in Rome, really? Well, like everywhere else, it was a staple, cheap, filling, and tasty. And unlike the modern processed slop, it was also nutritious. There was, according to Pliny the Elder, more nourishment in bread than in anything else. It was simply, in his words, quo vivitur, that which sustains life. For most people, bread made up a sizable proportion of their daily calorie intake. Barley, oats, and millets were the basic staples. Fancier flours came from other wheats like spelt, an ancient grain high in protein, and emmer, which is a very ancient forerunner to modern wheat. So we could, of course, have made this episode about Ceres, the goddess of grain and wheat, to whom the first fruits of the corn harvest were offered. However, Ceres isn't a forgotten goddess. You probably know of her. She's a well-known and prominent member of the Roman pantheon, and she isn't particularly in the shadows of Olympus either, although we could disambiguate her from her Greek counterpart Demeter. She is an Olympian, and she does hold the same role and fulfill much the same task in her Roman incarnation. In all your mythological explorations and excursions into Roman history, however, Fornax is a name you may never have stumbled on. And so it is to Fornax we turn our attention. Information about her is very limited, but what I'll try to do is give you a sense of her world, the domain that she presided over, and how that manifested in the lives of real people. In that way, by the end of this episode, you'll have a good sense of the space she held in the religious landscape, even though, by force of the evidence, she herself must remain a shadowy figure. She is, strictly speaking, the goddess of the oven. Fornax, in Latin, simply means oven, and it's the origin of the English word furnace. Ovens in the Roman world were commonly these big dome-shaped stone or brick ovens with the fiery chamber inside that are still in use today. You know them well as the wood-fired pizza ovens used by pizzerias, and her name still lingers in the name of such ovens in Italian, forno a capola. It takes a while to build a fire in them and make them hot, but once they're heated, they hold that heat for a long time and create the perfect conditions for baking bread or pizza. So Fornax is the deity of the oven, and in Italian today, the word for bakery is still simply forno. What we learn from the poet Ovid is the origin story of this goddess, which is to do with controlling the temperature and heat of her fiery space. He looks back to the times of early agriculture. After reaping the harvests, he describes a time when those ancient farmers were trying to bake their wheat to turn it later into flour. So I didn't know that's what happens. You need to dry grain for storage, which can be done simply in the sun. But apparently, if you're going to turn wheat into flour, there's a separate baking process for the harvested grain. So in Ovid's telling, the problem was that this process of baking these grains was a volatile one because the fire itself was difficult to control. As he describes it, they took the harvested grain and, taught by practice, they parched it in the flames and incurred many losses through their own mistakes. Sometimes they'd sweep up burnt ash and not grain. Sometimes the flames took their huts themselves. Instead of gently toasting the grain then, the fire either burned it to a crisp or got out of control and burned the entire building down. So to solve the problem, the farmers realized they needed divine help. And so Ovid tells us, the oven was made a goddess, Fornax. The farmers, pleased with her, prayed she'd regulate the grain's heat. Now obviously Ovid had no idea how this goddess really came into existence. What he knew is that she was very old, and he extrapolates her coming into the world of human worship by imagining how life had been before she was worshipped, and before she helped out these struggling rustics destroying their harvest and homes in the attempt to make bread. So her main function, which we can derive from this formulation, is actually that of regulating the heat of the oven. We hear the same sort of thing from the first century writer Plutarch, who situates Fornax again in the earliest incarnation of Roman religion. Plutarch tells us that the worship of Fornax was instituted by Rome's second ever king, King Numa, who was Rome's sacred king credited with formalizing Roman religion. Fornax was clearly thought to have been a very old deity who had inhabited Rome as long as the city itself had existed. And however and whenever she really did enter the world of Roman religion, we know she had an enduring importance because she had her own festival called the Fornicalia, the Feast of Ovens, a festival for roasting grain. And we'll think a little more about that later. The main point for now is that while we don't know much else about this goddess, this yearly celebration of her feast day makes her a well-known and visible deity to ancient Romans, even though she's thoroughly faded now from view. So let's think in a little more detail about where she was to be found, because ovens were not something that everyone had in their homes. In fact, very few people had them in their homes, partly because the majority of people were too poor to have anything so grand in their simple living spaces, and partly because, just as the myth tells us, the fire they contained was an enormous hazard. Especially in the urban environment, where whole tenements and neighborhoods regularly went up in flames. The city in general was a tinderbox, and it was far too much of a liability to put something so volatile in your home. Instead, most people got their bread fresh from the bakers. And since bread was such a staple in the Roman diet, so bakers and bakeries were a cornerstone of Roman life. And indeed, you'll see the remains of bakeries across the ruins of the Roman world, easily recognizable by their characteristic ovens. Pompeii has not only provided us with an image of a proto-pizza, wondrously preserved in that catastrophic eruption is the very bread itself. It's perhaps one of the most famous of Pompeii's treasures. A loaf of bread seems something so unlikely to survive volcanic ash, lava, pyroclastic flows, but there it is, someone's dinner, never eaten, but perfectly preserved, if slightly overcooked. This round bread, so characteristic of the Roman world, is the celebrated panis quadratus. It was tied with a string before baking it so that these sections were baked in, which made the bread easy to break into pieces. We see it represented in ancient frescoes and still lifes, and this carbonized 2,000-year-old loaf of bread, frozen in time, is, in its own way, a still life too. I find it somehow more touching than many of the site's other major treasures. It's just so ordinary, so familiar. It somehow makes the past and our human connection to it feel very immediate. Bread again, bridging time, culture, and distance. Fornax, as a goddess, is therefore to be expected wherever there were ovens, and in the countryside that makes her especially important for the harvest, as we've seen, and in the cities she's the patroness of bakeries. According to Pliny the Elder, the bakers didn't emerge in Roman society until the time of the war with the Macedonian king Perseus, which means roughly the early to mid-2nd century BCE. Before then, the Romans made the bread themselves, Pliny says, adding, and it was particularly the task of women. Whether or not this was true, and it probably was, male bakers, pistores, certainly emerged as cornerstones of everyday life. There was a professional guild for bakers, the Collegium Pistorum, which indeed dates back to the 2nd century BCE, and this was a collective that sought to protect the interests of bakers, standardizing weights, keeping quality controls, sharing trade secrets, that sort of thing. And since grain was so fundamental to the basic sustenance of Rome, the bakers were a vital link in that chain of providing the populace's bread. The fluctuating price of grain clearly affected bakers acutely, and whenever there was a grain shortage and the people were up in arms, the bakers themselves were vocal, but often bore the brunt of the hungry outrage. As the empire expanded, the grain supply came largely from Sicily and North Africa. Once Egypt was annexed, never mind its gold and riches, the fertile Nile Valley became such an important source of grain to the capital. Egypt is often referred to as the breadbasket of Rome. Under the emperors, the curiae annonae, meaning the care of annona, was an officially monitored grain dole, which attempted to keep a constant flow of subsidized imported grain coming to the city. Notice Annona here, who the grain dole was named after. She's another Roman goddess under whose auspices the empire-wide trade in grain kept a bountiful supply flowing into Rome. And so bakeries proliferated, and wherever we see them, we see by extension the flourishing of Fornax. But I think it's perhaps because she had this specific affinity with a trade, and because her cult was tended to by the tradespeople she looked after, that we hear less about her, even though she was clearly prominent and important. I think her specificity of interests, in the Guild of Bakers, for example, may explain why we don't know how she figured in bakers' conceptualizations of Fornax's sacred ovens. This is because we simply don't hear the voices of bakers in our literary sources. Literary endeavors were the privilege of the elite, who looked down upon labor and the dishonor of actually having to work for money. So the thoughts of bakers and the real concerns of their lives simply don't come down to us in literature. Which is not to say that they weren't literate, and we do hear from them in the archaeological record. This is the portrait of Terentius Neo and his wife from Pompeii. It's a famous fresco that's always brought out to illustrate how proud the Roman mercantile classes were of their success and literacy. And what you see in the portrait is Terentius Neo and his wife both posing as fashionable and affluent members of the bourgeoisie. His wife is particularly striking because she's depicted holding a stylus, which is a kind of pen, and a wax tablet for writing. And what this advertises is that she was of equal status to her husband, that she was competent and educated, and that she was literate. And wouldn't you just love to know what thoughts she might have scribbled on that wax tablet? The fresco is of particular interest to us here because the couple had made their successes as bakers. Their house actually incorporates the bakery from which they operated. So here you are looking upon the happy faces of two of Pompeii's successful and literate bakers. These are the kinds of people for whom Fornax would have been a deity of central significance. And it was through her careful control of their ovens, whole neighborhoods of Pompeii received their daily bread. For a very famous baker in Rome itself, we can turn to the celebrated tomb of Eurysakes. This extraordinary tomb is situated right outside the city gates at the Porta Maggiore on what used to be a major ancient road into Rome. As I photographed it here, it was somewhat overgrown with grass, but as striking and unusual as ever. And you can imagine this tomb really catching your attention and curiosity as you passed by into the ancient city. It dates to the end of the 1st century BCE and is a monument not only to Eurysakes the baker, but also to his trade that made him rich and successful. It's almost certain that Eurysakes was a freedman, meaning that he had once been a slave. However, upon gaining his freedom, he evidently did very well for himself. The inscription written in the lower relief tells us that this is the monument of Marcus Vergilius Eurysakes, baker, contractor, public servant, obviously. And the tomb records for all posterity the daily life of a bakery. The upper relief shows all sorts of scenes pertinent to the making of bread, from the milling of grain to the kneading of dough to the baking in the oven to the weighing out of loaves. While elite Romans were scornful of trades, as I said, and were snobbish about it, tradespeople themselves were rightly proud of them, especially when they'd become so accomplished and successful. Eurysakes himself had no desire to play it down or memorialize anything other than the trade with which he clearly so identified and presumably enjoyed. The strange shape of the tomb itself is a giant monument to the bakery. The strange holes in the upper half reference the giant kneading bowls, and the long cylinders at the bottom half are said to be grain silos. So wafting all about here is something of the world of Fornax, who again was no doubt a deity to whom Eurysakes gave much attention and gratitude. Rather tantalizingly, a few years ago, an excavation in the immediate vicinity even revealed a bakery, and people like to speculate whether it was the very one that made Eurysakes so rich. But smells are such ephemeral things, and the first to fade. While the stones of ovens last millennia, smells evaporate soon and without a trace. So I wonder whether, as the passer-by looked at this tomb as he or she wandered into town, I wonder if they were also greeted by the drifting scent of freshly baked bread, and if perhaps they were greeted and enticed by his old bakery nearby, still keeping his legacy alive. In any case, bakeries were everywhere. Bakers could grow rich from the profits, and everywhere Fornax was thriving. There's no known image of this goddess, but I suspect she was generally not imagined in human form so much as she was the amorphous numen, the divine, fiery spirit of the oven. And there used to be a fresco in another of Pompeii's preserved bakeries which had a female figure an old archaeologist had identified as Fornax, but this is the only photo I have of the fresco, and the image itself is very unclear. So even if this is Fornax, she remains a shadowy figure, but the image may actually just be Vesta. Some historians have even claimed that Fornax is just the god Vesta, but they only say this because there isn't much surviving evidence for Fornax, and because her domain does overlap to some extent with Vesta's. Vesta, being a goddess of the hearth, had some lesser-known associations with bread making, being that people could make simple bread in the hearth. However, ancient authors refer to her by her own name as a divinity in her own right, and there's absolutely no ancient author who so much as suggests that Fornax is Vesta. And moreover, what they do tell us quite clearly is that she was a distinct deity with a distinct role, and that she was, specifically, the goddess of ovens, and that furthermore, she had her own festival, the Fornicalia, which had absolutely nothing to do with the Vestalia. So it's just lazy scholarship, really, trying to conveniently explain her away by conflating her with a better-known deity, and I don't give the theory any credence. But I thought I'd better mention it, in case you ever find yourself in a heated discussion about Fornax in the future. You never know. So the festival is quite odd in the details we have of it, because the Fornicalia, the Feast of Fornax, was also known as the Feast of Fools. A couple of sources explain why, but honestly, there must be more beneath the surface of these explanations. I don't find them very illuminating, really. So bear with me and see what you think. The festival for Fornax was actually spread out over a series of unfixed days in February. It was a movable feast, and which day you celebrated depended on which curia you belonged to. Every Roman citizen was supposed to belong to a particular curia. These were something you can think of loosely as clans. They're just a politically organised way of grouping people, really. And the man in charge of all the curia was a priest known as the Curio Maximus. And so every year he would declare, apropos of I don't know what, which day the different curiae were to celebrate. And then, on the appointed day, all the members of each curiae would celebrate accordingly. We aren't told what they did, but clearly it involved celebrating, making and eating bread, and sacrificing and paying all due reverence to Fornax. So why the Feast of Fools? Well, Plutarch posed the same question, and he made his answer in the form of two questions. Is it the Feast of Fools because they apportioned that day to men who did not know to which curia they belonged? Or was it granted to those because of some business or absence from Rome or ignorance had not sacrificed with the rest of their curia on the Fornicalia, so that on this day they might also take their due enjoyment of that festival? And Ovid gives a similar answer. He explains that the Curio Maximus would declare, with a particular formula, the shifting date of the Fornicalia, and then tablets would be hung all around the forum, with each curia displaying its own sign and giving its own instructions. Ovid simply adds, "Foolish people don't know which is their curia, so they hold the feast on the last possible day." So this is all the evidence we have, but what both Plutarch and Ovid are saying is that there are some supposed idiots who just don't know which curia they belong to, and so all those lost fools just celebrate on the last possible day of the festival. Plutarch's alternative suggestion was that maybe some people missed the right day to celebrate for some valid reason, and so they also got the chance to make their celebrations on the last day. I mean, that doesn't sound so stupid to me. And if you didn't know which curia you belonged to, clearly something else was going on in your life, but probably foolishness wasn't it. So there is something strange and lost in the subtext here, I think, but that both Ovid and Plutarch find this, of all details, to be the important one to record when so precious little else about Fornax is said, suggests there is something to it. And while I can't give you an answer to why the goddess of the oven would become connected with the so-called fools who had somehow fallen through society's cracks, this sense that there's a whole other obscured side of things going on here allows me to transition to the shady underbelly of the bakery and the strange dark world of bread with which Fornax was also associated. So before I paint too wholesome and happy a picture of her world of ovens and fragrant odours, we now acknowledge the scorched, tough crust. To begin, if the name of the festival, the Fornicalia, sounded at first like some sort of seedy gathering or X-rated film, it must first be pointed out that there's an A in this word, coming from the name Fornax, and this is the Fornicalia, all about ovens and nothing to do with fornication. However, the connection between the two different words has long been pointed out and speculated over. You see, Fornax with an A meaning oven, and Fornix with an I meaning arch or vault may ultimately have the same root. And obviously, given the dome shape of the oven with its arch opening into the inner chamber, the oven and the arch also share a shape. All well and good, but how does this lead us to fornication? Well, fornix, the arch, is the root of our English, fornication, because this word was also the Roman slang for brothels. Because prostitutes used to advertise themselves by standing about under the arches of popular places like the circus and the amphitheatres, the arch became a euphemism for the trade. Now, this doesn't mean that we should tar fornax with that brush. There's nothing I know of in the ancient sources to suggest that she was explicitly implicated in that extra leap from brothel to oven. However, what we do find quite often, and quite surprisingly given the wholesome side of bakeries that we've so far explored, is that bakers and the bakery were often associated with disreputable goings-ons. Bakeries were castigated by Cicero as part of the city rabble, one of the sordid trades. Although this is perhaps his snobbish elite disdain for trades rather than any reflection about what went on in bakeries. Yet bakeries do repeatedly get this type of treatment. And part of this is surely the horrible nature of the places behind the scenes. While we've focused so far on the happy product of bread and the consumer side of things, or else the clean agricultural side of things with its fields of grain and the harvest, the linchpin of the bakery is the heavy millstone which turns the grain into flour, and the truth about that is that it was long, hard toil. This is not the kind of work Terentius Neo and his wife were doing, nor was Eurysakes the baker grinding away at his millstone. This was the work of slaves and donkeys mostly. It's physical work and hard labour. So in the last episode we saw the generous gifts of Pomona, the goddess of the orchard, providing her bounty freely without toil. If you remember, she was prized as providing the primordial bounty of trees that sustained people before the introduction of farming and cultivating land for crops. If you remember some of the words Pliny put in her mouth, she said, "I am unlike Mother Earth, all of whose gifts must be earned by toil, ploughing by bulls, beating on threshing floors, and then grinding between millstones, and all to produce food at some indefinite time and with immense labour." Well, here is the labour she was referring to. Often in dark, cramped spaces, hot and sweaty with ovens blazing, the workers grinding the millstone round and round were not in happy circumstances at all. So also in the news in 2023 was the discovery in Pompeii of what the headlines were calling prison bakeries, where they said enslaved people and working animals were worked to the bone in cruel conditions. I don't know where they got this idea of a prison bakery from. It's a bit silly, but it was plastered all over the place in different news outlets. Prisons have penal connotations and they don't really suit the context here. The discovery was nothing surprising or new. No one familiar with the ancient literature or the archaeology was under the impression that these were pleasant places to work. This was all fueled by slave labour, and certainly enslaved people and wretched blindfolded animals toiled thanklessly in this back-breaking work. So bakeries with mills attached had this horribleness at the heart of them, which we can't ignore. And for a description, we may turn to an ancient novel called The Golden Ass, which gives us so many excellent glimpses of ancient life. I highly recommend it. In the story, the main character gets turned into a donkey, and so he provides us a donkey-eye view of the Roman world. But he gets sold to what Apuleius calls a pistrinum, a mill and bakehouse, and he ends up in one of these places, and he describes the life of that detestable mill like this. Ye blessed gods, what a pack of dwarves those workers were, their skins stripped with livid welts, their seamed backs half visible through the ragged shirts they wore, some with loincloths, but all revealing their bodies under their clothes, foreheads branded, heads half-shaved and feet chained together. They were wretchedly sallow too, their eyes so bleary from the scorching heat of that smoke-filled darkness, they could barely see, and like wrestlers sprinkled with dust before a fight, they were coarsely whitened with floury ash. He then goes on to describe the donkeys, but I'll spare you that description. We've seen enough to understand that if bakeries included mills like this, then they already had a nefarious, low-life air about them, and it's easy to see how this could be the sort of place associated with all sorts of other wretchedness and deviance, just as ancient attitudes seem to echo. And prostitution is one that seems to linger around bakers and bakeries too. In fact, one ancient writer tells us that in Campania, harlots were called alicariae, which means mill girls, specifically spelt mill girls, because supposedly, according to Festus, they were accustomed to ply for gain before the mills of the spelt millers, which seems to put spelt millers in particular in the realm of red light districts. So Cicero also mentions these alicariae in Rome selling small cakes, presumably from the bakeries they haunted, which were in the shape of male and female genitalia and were meant for sacrifice to Venus and Priapus. Venus needs no explanation, and Priapus, you may recall from episode 9, who was an absurdly well-endowed deity of protection and fertility. So we can see that these may well be deities to attract these women and their wares. And they turn up again actually at the temple in a play by the Roman playwright Plautus. In the play, two slaves are supposed to be going to meet their master at the temple of Venus, but one of them's reluctant because of the crowd that he says is there at the moment at the altar. This is a crowd he describes as full of stinking, greasy people, among whom he lists common strumpets, bakers' mistresses, and cast-off girls from the spelt mill. So there clearly was sometimes in some quarters some sort of mental association between bakeries, mills, and harlots. Fornax isn't explicit in any of this, but in that collision of ideas between the archers and the heat of the furnace and the conflation of her ovens, Fornax, with the fornix of the brothel, suddenly the confusion of bread and fornication doesn't seem so wildly out of place. The Deacon Paulus, who preserved for us a potted version of the Roman author Festus, explains that, as time went on, the owners of these places turned the public mills into pernicious dens of iniquity. For as the millstones were fixed in places underground, they set up booths on either side of these chambers and caused harlots to stand for hire in them, so that by these means they deceived many, some that came for bread, others that hastened thither for the base gratifications of their wantonness. So I'm sorry if I've just destroyed your pleasant impression of bakeries as salubrious places with bakers as decent, upstanding pillars of the community. It's hard to say how prevalent this shady side of bakeries stretched into ordinary life, and certainly some neighbourhoods would be worse for it than others, and no doubt many bakeries didn't have mills attached and were just busy churning out proto-pizzas. But these dodgier dealings cannot be ignored as at least part of the world Fornax was privy to. And so just before we return to the sunnier side of the bakery, let me illustrate this point about its underbelly with one of the weirdest stories I've ever heard about them. It comes from late antiquity, from the ecclesiastical historian called Socrates Scholasticus. And he was writing at a time when the empire was officially Christian and the capital had shifted over to Constantinople. but he's writing about the Emperor Theodosius and his reformation of abuses at Rome. Theodosius went on a short trip to Italy and, we are told, conferred the greatest benefit on the city of Rome by removing two most infamous abuses which existed in the city. The first concerns a bakery and a mill house. There were buildings of immense magnitude, Socrates tells us, erected in ancient Rome in former times, in which bread was made for distribution among the people. Those who had the charge of these edifices, in process of time, converted them into receptacles for thieves. Now, as the bakehouses in these structures were placed underneath, they build taverns at the side of each where they keep prostitutes, by which means they entrapped many of those who went thither either for the sake of refreshment or to gratify their lusts. So far then it's sounding a lot like what some of the other writers have told us, but then things take a crazy turn, because he doesn't mean entrapped as in they lured them in to fleece them for their cash like what the other writers said. Socrates means literally to entrap them. For, he says, by a certain mechanical contrivance they precipitated them from the tavern into the bakehouse below. This was practiced chiefly upon strangers, and such as were in this way kidnapped and were compelled to work in the bakehouses, where many of them were immured until old age, not being allowed to go out and giving the impression to their friends that they were dead. So one minute people are having a beer and eating their bread, minding their own business or talking to the ladies, and the next minute this wicked trapdoor contraption thing snatches them away and flings them into the hellhole beneath, where they're put to work at the mill, never to escape. So how do we or Theodosius come to learn of this scam? Well, Socrates explained. It happened that one of the soldiers of the Emperor Theodosius fell into the snare, who, being shut up in the bakehouse and hindered from going out, drew a dagger which he wore and killed those who stood in his way, and the rest, being terrified, allowed him to escape. And when the emperor was made acquainted with the circumstance, he punished the Mancipes, that's the people who ran this place, and he ordered these haunts of lawless and abandoned characters to be pulled down. So isn't that mental? Socrates ends by concluding, this was one of the disgraceful nuisances of which the emperor purged the imperial city. So there we have it. Although Fornax is a little-known goddess now with sparse extant evidence, somehow in exploring her domain and attempting to flesh out something of her nature and character, this has turned into a longer rather than a shorter episode. We started out with Juvenal's quip about bread and circuses and asking what bread really meant to the Romans and what its role was in Roman society. And the sacred oven has taken some unexpected turns. We've gone from pizza to prostitution via fires, farmers, fools, and fornication. And as a result, we've spanned the full breadth of Fornax's realm, from the wafting smell of toasting grains on the autumn breeze to a carbonized loaf of bread baked by the furnace of a volcano. And from civilization to cultivation to kidnapping and a hard fall from grace, Fornax had her fingers in many pies, so to speak, and really deserves her own place in our series and to reclaim her rightful role in the landscape of Roman religion. And so, until next time, Fornax, and fare thee well.